Good morning. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy, and this is Friday, and the 9th of February. And we were looking in yesterday's episode at the story of Richard Case Nagell and how his position within the CIA as a double agent, working simultaneously with the Soviet KGB, gave him a unique access to inside information about the JFK assassination plot before it happened. And his access was through Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was the key. And we learned yesterday that Case Nagell had been assigned. He was stationed out of Mexico City. He was assigned to keep an eye on the fake defector that the Russians realized was a fake defector after he left Russia, on Lee Harvey Oswald. And so he followed him from place to place, just like Oswald was in Dallas, Fort Worth, New Orleans, Mexico City. So was Case Nagell. He was following him around. And of course, they had a relationship that went back years because they had served together in counterintel from their earliest time back in Atsugi. So they knew each other. So it made sense to KGB to assign him that task because it'd be easy for him to get close to Oswald. And what he learned was that Oswald had infiltrated Alpha 66, which was a CIA-backed anti-Castro organization, pretty extreme organization. And it was working on a plot to kill the president. And two of the Alpha 66 individuals that Oswald had gotten close to, Angel, or sometimes referred to as Angelo, and Leopoldo, were actually setting Oswald up to be the patsy in the assassination in the fall. Oswald had infiltrated the plan and was working to expose it and to foil it, just like he had in Chicago on November 2nd, or he would in Chicago on November 2nd. That was his intention in this whole thing, but what he didn't realize, but Case Nagell did, was that he was actually being set up to be the patsy. And so when Case Nagell reported back to his bosses at the KGB, hey, listen, there's an assassination plot to kill President Kennedy. Alpha 66, which is being led by David Atlee Phillips, the Mexico City Western Hemisphere CIA director, also a specialist in disinformation, the guy who was going to put the story together to incriminate Oswald, the Mexico City story. He's directing this whole thing. This is a CIA plot. And they've set up Oswald to be the fall guy. And of course, and Oswald doesn't know it. And so the KGB instructed their agent, Case Nagell, to let Oswald know so Oswald could sabotage it. Or they told him he'd have to kill him. And the reason was because they knew that if the assassination was blamed, if Oswald was the patsy, that by inference, they would be blamed because Oswald was a pro-Castro communist. He'd been sheep-dipped that way. He'd been to Russia. He married a Russian woman. He gave military secrets to the Russians. He tried to give up his citizenship. All summer in New Orleans, he had leafleted as a pro-Castro communist. And the ultimate objective in this was to get a war against Cuba. That's what they wanted. And so to blame Oswald is to blame Castro, to blame Russia, to blame the KGB, which is why the Mexico City story about Oswald meeting with Valery Kostikov, the assassination expert from the KGB, it was all leading back to them. And so they had to get rid of Oswald or have Oswald destroy the plan. And when we left off yesterday, Case Nagell tells Oswald doesn't believe him. Now, he'll come to believe him, but at the moment, he didn't believe him. And so that means Case Nagell, if he does what he's supposed to kill Oswald. He doesn't want to do that, whether they're friends or just close associates. He doesn't want to be a murderer. And so he comes up with what he thinks is a way to get around it and have somebody else destroy the plan instead. And that somebody else was supposed to be J. Edgar Hoover. And he sends that letter to J. Edgar Hoover, and he says, this is what's going down. This is who's been set up to take the fall. You need to be aware. And so today what we're going to do is find out what happened, find out the rest of the story. And the question today, so the two questions that we dealt with yesterday was what did the Russians know about Lee Harvey Oswald? When did they know it? Obviously, they knew as soon as he came home from Russia, came back to America, he was a fake defector. And they knew it right then. And they began, of course, we know the story of Marina, how they hitched their spy to our spy. So they got that going on, but they also assigned Richard Case Nagell to follow him around. They said if he's that important, that they will go to the lengths that they've gone to, talk about the Americans, to bring Oswald back home. They must have future plans for him, and we need to be aware of those future plans. So through Case Nagell's surveillance of Oswald and Oswald's infiltration, remember Oswald deal for him to come back was he had to inform for Bobby Kennedy on the CIA. So this is why he's doing this. This is why he's infiltrating these groups. So by Case Nagell surveilling the FBI informant on the CIA, he has learned about this plot. So the second question is, when did or what did the KGB, the Russians, know about the JFK assassination, and when did they know it? They know about it, as soon as Case Nagell figures out what Alpha 66 is up to, what Leopoldo and Angelo are trying to do with Oswald. He reports back to the KGB. They know everything at that point. So that answers those questions. Today's question is, what is the connection between an armed robbery in El Paso and the JFK assassination in Dallas? And this is the El Paso Times, as you see. Richard Case Nagell goes into this bank and he fired 2 shots up close to the ceiling. And he went out, sat in his car, waited to be arrested. And of course, they're portraying it as a bank robbery. It was never intended to be a bank robbery. It was intended to get himself arrested, put in jail for the key time that was coming. But that the paper doesn't know that, the reporter doesn't know that. So that's how they're spinning the story. All right, so this is the continuation of our story after he has written this letter to J. Edgar Hoover. And he warns Hoover in this letter that the assassination is planned for the 26th, the 27th, 28th, or the 29th of September. And it's in Washington, D.C. Now, interesting, I have studied this assassination for 25 years, and I've never heard, before I bumped into this story about Richard Case Nagell a few years ago, I'd never heard about an assassination plot in Washington, D.C. I'd heard all about the November 2 plot in Chicago. I'd heard all about Miami and Tampa Bay, and of course, ultimately in Dallas. I'd never heard anything about Washington, D.C. So what Nagell is saying is that Oswald is planning, or Alpha 66 is planning to set Oswald up to be the patsy of the assassination in Washington, D.C. at the end of September, which is interesting because 2 weeks earlier, remember now, Oswald always leaves a paper trail. 2 weeks earlier, on September 1st, 1963, Oswald had written to the Communist Party in New York City, and this is a copy of, and he always handwrites his letters, which is interesting. When other incriminating paperwork shows up, it's typed. We'll talk about that in tomorrow's episode, but that's one of the key distinguishing characteristics of all the paperwork, all the documentation that Oswald left that was incriminating. It was always handwritten. If anything ever showed up that was typed, it was a clue it wasn't him. Anyway, so he wrote to the Communist Party in New York City, quote, "Please advise me as to how I can contact the party in the Baltimore, Washington area, to which I shall relocate in October." Also on the same day, Oswald wrote to the Socialist Workers Party in New York, quote, "Please advise me as to how I can get into direct contact with SWP reps, Socialist Party reps, in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. I and my family are moving to that area in October." So Nagell is talking about an assassination plot that's going to take place in Washington, D.C., of which Oswald is going to be set up as the patsy. And Oswald, apart from this letter that Nagell has written to J. Edgar Hoover, Oswald's busy writing his letters to the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, asking for advice about party information and stuff in the Baltimore, Washington area. in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, in both cases, because he says we're moving there. Me and my family, we're moving there in October. So this is all being set up to show that eventually that the guy that did it, here's proof that he was planning to move to that area where the assassination is going to take place. He's planning to take his family and move to that area right after the assassination. This puts, okay, all this knowledge that Case Nagell has puts him in a real bind. Yeah, as a CIA agent, he was acting out one role as a double agent, serving with the KGB in the U.S. and Mexico. But as a KGB agent, as this counterintel guy for the CIA, he is acting out another role as an infiltrator of a CIA plot to kill JFK. So he's got two things going here. And he starts to think this thing through. And I think we talked about this at the end of yesterday's episode. If he does what the bidding of the KGB, what they want him to do, which is to warn Oswald and then kill him if the warning doesn't take, then he's committing murder against a CIA agent. And that's murder, right? And you remember when he gets arrested, he says he'd rather get arrested and sit in jail than commit murder or treason against a U.S. intelligence asset at the behest of the America's enemy, the Soviet Union. On the other hand, if he does nothing and the plot succeeds, he would be an unwitting participant. He would have gone along with the patsy, and he could be set up as well to be the patsy. And that's at the very least. At the worst, he's guilty of treason because he participated in a plot, whether he did anything actively or not. He allowed it to happen, and that's treason, killing the president. So he is really between a rock and a hard place, which is why he writes that letter to J. Edgar Hoover. Now he's not done, because he realizes, okay, I've done what I can. I've notified somebody in the official channels to be able to do something, but I'm still out here, and I can still be manipulated or ordered to do this or to do that, and end up as a part of this whole thing. So he hatches this escape plan. And he says, I'm going to remove myself from both situations. I'm going to remove myself from the CIA. CIA is trying to kill the president. And I'm a CIA agent. I'm going to remove myself from that. I'm also going to remove myself from the KGB and my handlers and all their orders for me to kill Oswald. I just don't want any part of it. I'm getting out. I'm backing out. And so he figured the safest place for him was in a jail cell. So he comes up with this idea. He says, I'm going to go to this bank and I'm going to fake basically a burglary, get myself arrested, and I'll place myself in federal custody, in September, the end of September, before all this is scheduled to go down. That way, there won't be any of my fingerprints on any of this. And so he ends up getting, he tells the arresting officer he'd rather, be in jail than commit murder and treason. I'm sure they're scratching their heads wondering what in the heck that all means, but he knows what this means. And so he ends up pleading guilty, and he's in jail for 4.5 years for armed robbery. And during which time, of course, we all know what happened. The Washington, D.C. plot, because of the letter, and actually two things, because of the letter that Nagell sent to the FBI, and because of his arrest and giving himself up like this, it brought attention. And since Oswald was already being moved into a position to be Washington, D.C.'s patsy, like he would be later in Dallas, anyone that, if he's the patsy and he's arrested, anyone who has any association with him is going to pop later. And so they realize, we're going to have to put this off. Nagell's kind of complicated things here. He wrote this letter to J. Edgar Hoover. Now he's got himself arrested. He's talking about murder and treason. He seems like a loose end. And he's not going to go along with the plot. So we're going to have to reconfigure this. So they they put off the assassination for another 2 months. The Washington, D.C. plot falls apart. Why? Because of Richard Case Nagell. Him writing that letter to J. Edgar Hoover, and then him getting arrested on September 20. This is within 4 or 5 days of when the plot is supposed to occur. And so they suspend the plot for a couple months to work around this little complicating factor that Richard Case Nagell has become. So we all know what happens next because we've talked about it in previous episodes. The end of September comes. Oswald gets, instead of moving to Washington, D.C., he gets on a bus and heads to Mexico City. Witnesses saw him on the 25th. And then that whole Mexico City saga, this story that David Atlee Phillips comes up, and it might be that David Atlee Phillips comes up with the story kind of by the seat of his pants. It might have been one of these last minute things because the original plan was for him to go to Washington. And that's why he's writing these letters saying they're moving there. And that's where the assassination is going to take place. And there's not going to be any need for a Mexico City story. And then all of a sudden, Richard Case Nagell throws a monkey wrench into the whole plan. And so now all of a sudden, the Mexico City story becomes necessary. I've always wondered why the story was so slipshod, why it was so easy to refute. You know, when Marita Lorenz looks at the picture of Oswald after he's arrested and compares it to the Oswald that she met with 3 times at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, she says, it's not the same guy. And when the CIA says they have voice recordings, the FBI listens to him, it's not the same guy. And when the CIA puts out the photographs of the guy they said signed in as Lee Harvey Oswald, everybody looks at it, it's not the same guy. I mean, it was a bad story. And then you got doppelgangers in Dallas. Sylvia Odio's story becomes a complicating factor. You know, he appears at that Ford dealership, or actually it was a Lincoln Mercury dealership. I think it was a Lincoln Mercury, Bolton Ford. It was Bolton Ford. And, you know, that was supposed to be the same time he's down in Mexico City. So you got doppelgangers popping up in the wrong place. So it was a bad story. It fell apart quickly. J. Edgar Hoover told Lyndon Baines Johnson the story's bullshit. There's no truth to it. So even David Atlee Phillips, the guy who came up with the story, had to disavow it later. But I think this Richard Case Nagell situation put them under the gun to hurry up and come up with something. And this was a story they put together quickly, and it fell apart quickly. So after the Mexico City thing, and we'll talk about the Mexico City. That's coming up, I promise. Because I believe he did go to Mexico City, just not for the reasons the CIA said he went. And they certainly don't want anyone to know the real reason. So when he is trying to go to Cuba, he's trying to deliver something, but he's being prevented and he's getting frustrated. And at the last minute, the CIA handler tells him, hey, forget that. You're not going to Cuba. You're going back to Dallas. You're going to Dallas. That's the next assignment for you. So he gets redirected to Dallas. So in late October, now that he's in Dallas, Oswald writes back to the Communist Party, again, paper trail. And he says, in September, I had written you saying I was expected to move from New Orleans, Louisiana to the Philadelphia, Baltimore area. Since then, my personal plans have changed and I have settled in Dallas, Texas for the time. Okay, so here again, he's leaving a paper trail where investigators can find him after the assassination that's planned for Dallas. He's just laying out the breadcrumbs like Hansel and Gretel so that the investigation will lead right back to him. And of course, we all know by this point, he's not doing this on his own. He's being told to do everything that he does. So, Nagell, if we just fast forward and talk about what happened to him going forward, in the late 1960s, after the assassination and you know, everything happens with Oswald and such. In the late 1960s, Richard Case Nagell barely survived 3 different separate attempts on his life. And he starts to realize that he's, you know, probably most likely because of the information he has. And he has information that could really become important. I mean, I think, like Jim Garrison said, he's the most important witness. And so he's dodging bullets. 3 times they try to take him out. If you think about the context, the late 60s, the Warren report has already been published. That came out in 64. So, that's done. But by the late 60s, that's when Jim Garrison is bringing the Clay Shaw trial down in New Orleans. And that's how Jim Garrison finds out about Richard Case Nagell. And this is going to be all new evidence. And this is going to be explosive stuff. So Garrison's plan is to put Richard Case Nagell on the stand and have him testify to the story that I'm telling you. And you can imagine the waves that would cause, because no one American has heard of any of this stuff. This would be big news. Richard Case Nagell decides he's not going to have any part of this because he wants to stay alive, and he admits it later. When he comes forward later, he admits, "Hey, I stayed quiet because I wanted to keep my benefits from the military. I wanted to stay alive. I wanted my family not to be harmed." And so he got the message. The message was keep quiet. So he didn't really say anything, but somehow his story gets out. And in October 31st, right at the end of October of 1995, the Assassination Records Review Board, the AARB, mails Nagell a letter. And they're asking for documents. That word has gotten back to the AARB. And that's what the Assassination Records Review Board was about, was procuring documents related to the assassination. They heard he had some documents, and that he had information about a conspiracy to assassinate JFK, and he had some documents relating to that. So they write him a letter, and they say, if an official government body ever, he had told an assassination researcher named Dick Russell that he had kept quiet. He told us the story about how he had barely survived 3 attempts on his life, and that's why he kept quiet. And he just didn't feel like there was anybody serious out there that would listen to his story and take it seriously. But he said to Dick Russell, if an official government body ever did take me seriously, I'd probably cooperate. He told Dick Russell that. Dick Russell gets interviewed through the AARB and tells this story to the AARB. So the AARB contacts Richard Nagell on October 31st, 1995. The very next day, November 1st, 1995, Richard Case Nagell is found dead in his bathroom. And of course, it's ruled a heart attack. It was a very suspicious death. He had no history of heart problems, and hadn't complained of anything. Just one day he's just found dead. The day after the AARB sends him a letter requesting his cooperation in their investigation. So, he had good reason to keep quiet. He understood those 3 attempts on his life were serious. And the first time he even, it even appears he's going to cooperate with an official government body that's investigating assassination, he ends up dead. So the story doesn't end there. Before he died, Nagell had told his niece that there was a purple trunk. And he said, there's documents in that purple trunk. He told her, inside that purple trunk is, quote, what everybody's trying to get hold of. He said he had documents and he had audio tapes, things of that nature. And so his son, named Robert, found an address for Tucson, Arizona. It was a storage unit. And after he died, he's going through his things and he found this address. He decided to go to Tucson, Arizona and see what was up. He drives to that storage unit, Tucson, Arizona, and he finds that everything's there except one thing: the purple trunk is gone. Meanwhile, as he's en route, either going or coming to Tucson, his own house was broken into and ransacked. When he got home, his house had been burglarized. So the purple trunk with all the documents and audio tapes that Richard Case Nagell said he has gone, and his son's house is burglarized. None of this stuff happened until Richard Case Nagell got a letter from the ARB asking his cooperation with their investigation. And all of a sudden, all this stuff kicked into action, meaning they were keeping tabs on him. They were watching him. Somebody was watching him. According to Dick Russell, who had kind of wiggled into Nagell's trust Yeah, he got to be trusted by Richard Case Nagell. Dick Russell had met with him, and they'd become friends, kind of on again, off again friends, but at least associates. And Nagell trusted him. And Dick Russell said that later in life, Nagell grew increasingly despondent about his role in the JFK assassination. He felt like he didn't do enough. And he told Russell, he says, quote, "Sometimes I get thinking and I can't go to sleep, thinking what I could have done, the mistakes that it could have been handled differently. I was in a quandary in September 1963. I didn't know what to do. What did I accomplish? Not a goddamn thing." And he just felt terrible about it. Uh, his letter to J. Edgar Hoover didn't work. He thought, like I said yesterday, he thought J. Edgar Hoover was an honest broker. Turns out J. Edgar Hoover just sat on the information, didn't do anything with it. He thought by getting arrested, it would foil the plan. It would expose the plan and foil it. They just redirected it, waited a couple months, and did it again in Dallas and used the same patsy. His legacy, though, you've got to give him, that he's, like Jim Garrison said, he's the most important witness. He didn't intend to become an active participant in the conspiracy to kill JFK. He just got into that situation because of his role as a CIA double agent. He was mixing with people unwittingly. His job originally was to watch Oswald. So everywhere Oswald went, he went. Well, Oswald's job was to infiltrate the CIA groups and report back to the FBI. And meanwhile, Oswald's also doing CIA stuff, being sheep dipped as this communist. And so what he realizes as he's watching this, Nagell, is that Oswald is being set up to be the patsy, and here he is infiltrating Alpha 66, and he's reporting to the FBI. There's, that Alpha 66 is launching all these attacks on Cuba. And so Kennedy and the White House, they shut all that down. And then he infiltrates the assassination plot. And as such, Nagell finds out about it because he's surveilling Oswald, reports back to the KGB. KGB realizes, oh my goodness, they're going to blame it on us. If they're going to use Oswald as the patsy, they're going to blame it on us. There's going to be a war in Cuba that could lead to a war between us and the Soviets and the Americans. We got to get rid of this plot. We got to destroy it. Tell Oswald. And if he doesn't listen, if he doesn't believe you, kill him. Take the patsy out, and it'll screw up their whole plan. He doesn't kill him. He sends the letter to J. Edgar Hoover, and he gets himself arrested, takes himself out of the plot. I guess what Nagell could have done is, kidnapped Oswald or something of that nature. But I think he felt like he'd done all he could do. And then he took himself out, hoping to bring attention to this whole thing. And maybe by him getting arrested and saying what he said about murder and treason, somebody else would investigate it. And of course, he's counting on the fact that maybe the FBI director would investigate it. None of that happens. And it does show that he's trying to do the right thing. When he wrote that letter to Hoover, Nagell's trying to do the right thing. You're taught, report something if you know it. He did it. He reported it. And then 3 days later, he gets himself arrested, showing a little bit of creativity in a way to resist this plot, to try to sabotage it his own way. He did sort of sabotage it. He delayed it by 2 months, but the regret is, according to Dick Russell, Nagell's biggest regret was that he waited 30 years to come out and say what he knew. He said, and in the end, he ended up dead anyway. He waited 30 years and thought enough time had passed. And so when the AARB contacts him, I guess his people that were watching him, which would be the CIA, felt like, well, he's probably going to cooperate, so we need to get rid of him. And he dies the next day. So the lesson there is, the moral of the story is, it didn't benefit him. I guess he lived a few more decades of life, but as far as the plot, uncovering the plot and his role in it, he could have done a lot if he'd come out earlier and told his story. And if you remember now, he was going to tell his story in the Jim Garrison trial, that at least to Jim Garrison, but he didn't want to publicly testify because he knew what would happen to him. But he was warned in the late 60s, 3 attempts on his life. So that was probably the moment. If you ask Nagell, and Dick Russell said this, if you ask Nagell, the biggest regret he had was responding to those 3 attempts on his life by shutting up and being quiet. He needed the money, he needed the benefits, his retirement benefits in the military, and he wanted to stay alive. And so he did not testify. And that happened to Garrison over and over. People that were going to testify. I think Garrison would have busted the whole thing open in the late 60s, but his chief witnesses kept dying on him. Like David Ferry died, Guy Bannister had died. Obviously Oswald's dead by that point. Richard Case Nagell won't testify. And so one by one, all the witnesses that could have helped put this whole thing to rest in the late 60s, fell apart on him. And so the whole trial fell apart on him. So anyway, that's the story of Richard Case Nagell. And I think what we see here, going back to the original question, is what's the connection between this kind of strange armed robbery in El Paso, Texas, and the assassination in Dallas? The connection is that the guy who knew about this plot and revealed the existence of this plot to the Soviet KGB and also to the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, was the guy who attempted this armed robbery so as not to commit murder and treason, because he had been ordered to kill Oswald, the guy that's being set up to be the patsy, or to stand as a CIA agent, to stand aside and just let it happen. And that would be treason. One's murder, the other's treason. So in his efforts to not commit murder or not commit treason, he commits this armed robbery instead and foils the plot in Washington, D.C. And maybe for 2 months thought, hey, what I did worked. I get small price to pay. I'm sitting here in a jail cell for 4.5 years, but at least it worked. Well, then 2 months later, it happens in Dallas. And everything that he had predicted came to pass. Oswald was set up. He's the patsy. And then before Oswald can, you think about what Oswald knew. Richard Case Nagell came to him in September and told him all this. So if there is a trial, Oswald already said in the halls of the Dallas Police Department, I'm just a patsy. So Oswald had put this together. He knew what was up. So just as they couldn't allow Richard Case Nagell to testify in Jim Garrison's trial in the late 60s, and they couldn't let him speak to the AARB in the 90s, they also could not let Lee Harvey Oswald speak about anything to anybody, and they had to take him out before there was any trial. And so you see what happens to people who, the folks in the know where their loose ends are, and they are very good at taking out or cleaning up those loose ends. So that's the story of Richard Case Nagell. We have one more part in this episode series about what the Russians knew. We'll discuss that tomorrow. Another document that proves that Oswald was being set up, and it was a direct interaction with the Soviets. That is another way that they knew what was fixing to happen. And of course, this happens in the months before the assassination. So where I begin and end with all of this is that the Soviets knew months before the assassination that his life was in danger, and that they pretty much knew what the plot was and who was behind it. And so that when the assassination happens, they're ready. They're ready to give an answer to it so that they can't be blamed. They had time. They had lead time to prepare for this. They knew what was coming down the pike. So because they had infiltrated, Richard Case Nagell, probably one of the smartest things the Soviets did was playing dumb after Oswald took him for a ride as a fake defector, playing dumb, pretending like they never figured it out, but they did, and attaching Marina to his side and attaching Richard Case Nagell to his side and following him. He led them like Hansel and Gretel. He led them right to the prize. They knew in advance. They knew before it happened what was fixing to happen. And it was because they followed Oswald. Their suspicion, their intuition that Oswald was important enough for the Americans to bring back after his mission in Russia. That intuition served them well. And that's why they knew before the assassination happened that it was going to happen. All right, so that concludes episode, I believe that's 29, 28 or 29. I think it's 29. I could be wrong. Anyway, if you enjoy what you're listening to or hearing, please subscribe. It's free. Hit the notification bell, hit the thumbs up, and please don't be bashful about adding comments. Enjoy reading those comments. I try to respond to them as I get them throughout the course of the day. Also, check out my website, standardsplushistoryacademy.com. All kinds of content there. And until next time, have a good day. Thank you.